Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Eggs at St. Anselm College. On this first Friday of Lent, I was told people were very impressed. We did not have bacon at the buffet this morning. So, it is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning. We have many distinguished guests, including the great mayor of the city of Manchester, Joyce Craig. And the great chair of the Democratic Party in the state of New Hampshire, Ray Buckley. We are always thrilled to host these events. As many of you know, we've been doing this for quite some time. And this morning we have the great honor of listening to Mayor Pete from South Bend, Indiana. Some of you may or may not know, St. Anselm College has an interesting relationship with a little Catholic college in South Bend. We have a 3-2 engineering program where we send our students after 3 years to South Bend to get their engineering degree. So I've had plenty of opportunity to get to know the University of Notre Dame and Father Jenkins. Wonderful place, wonderful town. And so we are very honored to have you here with us this morning. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome the CEO, President of the New England Council, who will introduce the mayor. And I will note that on a week away from St. Patrick's Day, I did my best to try to look like Jim Brett.
Take more than a tie to make it. Sorry, I didn't know the mic was on. I'm sorry, yeah. Sorry, yeah. The mic is on? Okay. Can I also just acknowledge the presence of 2 former members of the United States Congress who are sitting together at the table here. Many of you know Paul Hodes, who served with honor and distinction for your great state here and for our country, is here. I just want to acknowledge his presence. And Michael Harrington was a prominent member of Congress a few years ago and made a mark in the United States Congress, a very good friend to all of us in the New England Council, represented the North Shore of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with distinction and with great credit to his constituents. So we're honored to have him here. And let me also acknowledge the presence of our partner here, the president, who's done an outstanding job, and working with the staff here, with Larry Zabar of our office. And these programs would not be as successful without his support and the support of his dedicated staff, Neil Levesque in particular. So we thank him and his staff for all the great work they do. The 2019 truly has been a very, very busy period for the New England Council. Believe it or not, this morning's breakfast, I believe, is the 7th Politics and Eggs event that we've held already in the first 2 months. We've also had several other great events. In the past, I think we've had 18 events in the first 2 months, which is incredible. And we've not taken our foot off the gas pedal, to say the least. On Monday morning, we'll hear from the Irish Minister for Communications and Climate Change and the Environment, Richard Bruton, at a breakfast in Boston. We'll be back here, the Granite State, on Monday, March 18th, for our first Congressional Roundtable event with the newly elected congressman from the 1st Congressional District, Chris Pappas. It'll be held just up the road at the BVI. Following day, we'll be in Providence for a Congressional Roundtable with the congressman from the 1st Congressional District, Congressman Jim Langevin. And we'll wrap up the month in Washington for one of our many popular Capitol Conversation breakfast events with Congressman Joe Courtney of Connecticut. And speaking of D.C., we look forward to seeing many of you at our annual Washington Leaders Conference, which has been known as the annual event in years past. It'll be held on May 8th and 9th. We'll have a great opportunity to meet with journalists, members of Congress, members of the United States Senate, and other distinguished guests. And we hope that many of you will participate In years past, we've had over 250 people from all of 6 New England states participate. It's a great event, and we look forward to seeing many of you here. But today, we're very pleased to introduce the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg. Mayor Pete was born and raised and in the city that he leads, and I believe he also lives in his old neighborhood. He's the son of 2 Notre Dame professors. No one's perfect. One of his first visits to New England came, and I was aware of this, being a member of the John F. Kennedy Board of Trustees myself. One of his first visits to New England came, his senior of high school, when he visited the JFK Library in Boston to be honored for his prize-winning essay in the Profile and Courage Essay Contest. He returned to the Boston area to attend Harvard University, where he studied history and literature and graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. He went on to earn a master's at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. In 2011, he was elected the mayor of the great city of South Bend at the age of 29. He was re-elected to a second term in 2015 with 80% of the vote. Obviously, they did not count the votes, they weighed them. 80%. A member of the Naval Reserve, he took a leave from his post as mayor for a deployment to Afghanistan in 2011, where he served as a naval intelligence officer. He remains a lieutenant in the Navy Reserve today. Now, in the final year of his second term as mayor, he has racked up an impressive list of accomplishments. He's made redevelopment a top priority, launching a vacant and abandoned properties initiative, which achieved its goal of repairing or demolishing 1,000 properties in 1,000 days. His $25 million Street Smarts initiative resulted in the conversion of many downtown one-way streets to two-way use, and also added pedestrian and bike-friendly amenities. And finally, under his leadership, the city has remained, I think it's re-emerged its role as a global economy with major investments in advanced industries that he's focused on, I believe, in data and technology. So it's no surprise that in 2013, GovFresh.com named him Mayor of the Year, or that the Washington Post has described him as, quote, the most interesting mayor you've never heard of, citing his age, impressive education, military background, and record of accomplishments in South Bend. And now he's launched his career on his campaign for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. We're just honored that he would take time to be here today. He would be the youngest and the first openly gay United States president. We are honored that he could join us today. Please give a very warm welcome to the Honorable Mayor of the great city of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, which I will remember in the event that I'm ever asked to procure Notre Dame football tickets for anybody here. No, really an honor to be here. I want to thank St. Anselm College, the Institute of Politics. I was educated, as I say to people when I meet people in England, I also say to people I meet in New England, I was educated in your country. And the Institute of Politics that I was part of as a student made a very big impression on me. It's an honor to be with so many current and former elected leaders, to be seated with a fellow mayor. Mayor Craig, thanks for the warm welcome into your community. And to be reunited with Chairman Buckley, who I got to know during another process that led to a great many competitors, where I began to feel like I was competing against the House when we were running for chair of the DNC. I returned to being mayor, and he returned to being New Hampshire Democratic chair. Each job, I would argue, at the end of the day, more enviable than being chair of the DNC. So I think we came out just fine. But also, as I'm sure you all know, a towering figure in Democratic politics beyond the borders of this state. I bring greetings from South Bend, Indiana, and I guess what I ought to do at the outset, and I aim to keep my remarks pretty short so that we can entertain as many questions and ideas as possible. But at the outset, I should probably just address the question that if anybody doesn't ask it, it's out of politeness, which is what makes a 37-year-old mayor of a mid-sized Midwestern city think he has any business being among the speakers who would come to a place like this to talk about the future of the free world and the American presidency. And I'll aim to explain that in very short order, because I am also pretty surprised that this is how I'm spending my 2019. But I also believe that we're at a moment where even now we may be underreacting to the situation that our country is in. And I don't only mean the chaos surrounding the current president and the current presidency. What I really mean is the pace of change is accelerating to the point that we may be at a hinge point between different eras in American political and social life. And it is going to call for solutions that are bolder and in many ways different in character than anything we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years that might be characterized as adjusting a system that no longer works, economically or politically, for so many people in so many different parts of the country, including in the industrial Midwest where I live. And that's why a millennial Midwestern mayor might have something different to offer. A mayor because, as Mayor Craig and the other former mayors who are here know, the level of government that is most immediate, most intimate, and most urgent is the level of city government. And I wonder if the former members of Congress joining might agree that we would be well served if Congress and Washington began to resemble our best run cities and towns rather than the other way around. You know, mayors, for example, will never shut down a government over an ideological disagreement. It's unthinkable. We deliver water. You need water to live. So it simply doesn't happen. Problems have to get solved in a different way. And at a moment when so many pressures are acting, so many forces are acting on the system in Washington, I would argue that more and more American leadership is emerging at the local level, unlikely to command the same kind of national attention that gets you on cable news these days, but arguably something we need more of in our nation's capital. Why Midwestern? Well, I don't seek to be a regional candidate or to only represent one region, but I do believe my party, the Democratic Party, has some work to do when it comes to reconnecting with the middle of the country, especially communities like mine. And I should probably pause for those who don't know South Bend and only see it 6 times a year for football games and might assume that we're a prototypical, wealthy, white, homogeneous college town. I should probably let you know that we're celebrating the fact that our per capita income this year just went above $20,000 for the first time in a long time. I should probably let you know that we're about 45% non-white. You may know about us because of Notre Dame, but we grew up not around education, but around industry. We're one of those towns like so many other towns in so many parts of the country, and especially in the so-called Rust Belt in the industrial heartland, that was brought to its knees by the closure of auto factories in the 1960s. Studebaker was headquartered in South Bend. We've got a museum full of Studebakers. And when it closed, overnight thousands of jobs vanished. And when I was running for mayor 50 years later, people were still talking about how do we get some version of Studebaker to come back? And I had to have a very honest conversation as this fresh-faced 29-year-old about why that wasn't going to happen and why we could still come back even though some of those old ways of life weren't, and how we could still have a future in advanced manufacturing but not be so reliant on manufacturing that we were at the whim of changes in trade and automation and globalization, that we had to find a way to make change work for us. And we have. The month I got into the race for mayor, Newsweek came through and had a list of 10 American dying cities. And so I'm very proud to report to you, with that having happened to us at the beginning of the decade, with us number 8 on that list of dying cities, that now, as we approach the end of the decade, our city is back. As you were kind to mention in the introduction, we've replaced and removed vacant and abandoned houses. We've added jobs. Our population is growing. And it's not just a story to me about one city and how we changed our future. It's an answer to the suggestion coming out of this White House that the only way to speak to Midwestern communities or industrial communities or rural communities is through resentment and nostalgia. Telling us to look for greatness in all of the wrong places, suggesting that the way to greatness is to turn back the clock and look into our past. When the very things that made our communities and our country great in the past was the fact that our forebears kept their eyes focused squarely on the future. That is why I believe our city's story means a lot to the rest of the country, especially at this moment when a lot of people where I come from almost literally can't hear the Democratic Party. So, that's why I'm mayor, that's why I'm Midwesterner, and why a millennial. Why should a millennial be in the mix at all? Other than that we happen to be the largest voting bloc now, or would be if young people were voting at the rate that I would like to get young people voting. But it isn't just about a young candidate for young voters. I think we have the opportunity to build a generational alliance, because I think every generation wants to see the country on track to be in good shape by, let's say, 2054, which is when I would reach the current age of the current president. And being born when I was born has some specific implications. First of all, I was in high school when the Columbine shooting happened. I literally belonged to the school shooting generation. And I understand what is in the eyes of young people who are calling an older generation to account for our failure to keep them safe. I belong to the generation that will be dealing for the rest of our lives with the implications of climate change. That is a personal issue for us, not a theoretical one. And so too is the economic question of whether we are on track to be the first generation in American history to earn less than our parents if nothing is done to change the trajectory of this economy. And by the way, not for lack of contributing, because we were also the generation that provided most of the troops, including me, for the conflicts after 9/11. This is a moment to build a generational alliance to make sure that the future is better than the past, as it always has been, along the trajectory of this country. And I believe in order for that to happen, our generation needs to put forward more voices in leadership at the very highest level. Because I also believe then we have an opportunity to find a new vocabulary for talking about our democratic values. And my entry, by the way, into that question of what our values actually are, to me consists of three words. I want to put an end to the hand-wringing over whether the Democratic Party is capable of fashioning a message that would fit on a bumper sticker. So here's my entry into the bumper sticker contest. Freedom, democracy, security. Three things that I think our party needs to get in the habit of talking about a lot more. Freedom, because we have allowed our conservative and libertarian friends to define freedom in a very narrow fashion, as though freedom from government were the only kind of freedom that mattered, as though government were the only sort of thing that could make you unfree. And yet, at least in my lived experience, there's a lot more to freedom than freedom from. There's a lot to be said for freedom to. For example, you are free to start a small business only if you know that leaving your employer doesn't mean losing your health care. So health care is freedom. On this International Women's Day, I would argue that reproductive freedom is freedom of the highest and most important order and ought to be secured by people on our side of the aisle and every side of the aisle. Freedom to organize, freedom to marry, a freedom that transformed the trajectory of my life and was brought to me by the grace of a single vote on the United States Supreme Court. So maybe it's time for our side of the aisle to get back into the business. And I say this in the state that lives by the motto, live free or die. Maybe we ought to be talking more about freedom. Democracy, which is literally coming up for a vote in the U.S. House in the form of H.R. 1, a sweeping anti-corruption and pro-democracy package designed to make it possible for more people to exercise their right to vote and to make sure that those votes are counted and to make sure that those votes are weighed fairly in a system where I'm afraid the dollars have come to be able to outvote people. We have got to do something if we want to call ourselves a democracy. And as someone on the drive time morning radio I called into here reminded me, we are not a direct democracy, and that is true. But democracy as a value, if we are not that, what are we? as a country. And yet, we may be becoming less democratic as we speak. We're slipping in the rankings. Freedom House ranks countries for freedom and democracy. We're slipping because it's becoming harder to vote. Because gerrymandering allows politicians to pick their voters other than the traditional fashion that I think most of us prefer, where voters get to pick our politicians. And because of things that don't get as much attention, like the fact that our fellow U.S. citizens in a place like D.C. or Puerto Rico don't have proper political representation. We simply tolerated that as though it were something that could not possibly be fixed. We've tolerated a system in which, in my short lifetime, at my tender age, the Electoral College has overruled the American people not once but twice, and want to say that we're a democratic country. So let's defend freedom and democracy in its truest form, and let's talk about security. But let's acknowledge that there is more to security than something like building a wall from sea to shining sea. Let's acknowledge that there's more to security than the sorts of things I worked on when I was taking up arms in defense of our nation as a specialist in counterterrorism. Let's acknowledge that security in the 21st century also means cybersecurity, which no wall can help you with. It means election security, and it means climate security. You know, twice I found myself activating the Emergency Operations Center of the city of South Bend for what I was told was a historic flood. The first one was a 500-year flood, and the second one was a 1,000-year flood, and they were 18 months apart. So either I have some preposterous statistical luck and I ought to be getting down to the casino fast, or we've got a security problem. Parts of California are catching on fire, and I go down to a meeting with my fellow mayors, and the ones from Florida are dealing with sea level rise affecting their city today, not as a theoretical problem for somebody else to deal with, right now. So are we or are we not prepared to acknowledge that climate is a security issue? These are the kinds of things I think we need to be talking about. It is not a different set of values than what has motivated my party at its best for as long as I've been alive and longer. But it does require, in my view, a different vocabulary and a different approach. And maybe, just maybe, a different kind of messenger too. So that's why I'm here, but I promise to be relatively short on monologues. So let me just suspend my remarks and invite any questions or comments that could carry us forward.
We have students that have the microphone, so if you just identify yourself, and maybe I could just ask the first question.
Please.
Mr. Mayor, you talk about democracy is slipping. You have some bold ideas regarding electoral college, abolishing. You talk about expanding the Supreme Court from 9 to 15. Can you talk about those two proposals and why it's necessary to do that?
Yeah, sure. So the first, at risk of sounding simple-minded, is based on the idea that the person who gets the most votes ought to win. And I'm talking about the general election. I'm not talking about the primary calendar. Just want to make sure that's clear to everybody in my New Hampshire audience. But I live in the state of Indiana. It doesn't matter most years what we think, because our state's too conservative to matter in the Electoral College. And if you live in California, it doesn't really matter what you think, because your state's too liberal to matter in the Electoral College. I just believe that we'd be better served if we had a system where the person who gets the most votes actually wins the election. So that's my take on that one. The Supreme Court, to me, it's not so much a question of have we figured out today in 2019 the exact right model? But I think the debate must begin. And it's not a debate over how to make the court more progressive. Obviously, I would like to see a court that is in line with my values, so would everybody else. The question to me is, how do we arrest the decline in the perception of the court toward being viewed as a nakedly political institution? And I think that we need to entertain structural reforms, by the way, many of which would not require constitutional change, only statute, but entertain reforms that would deal with that. One flavor, people have talked about adding justices. That is one way to address it. Some people have talked about rotating, simply having everybody rotate up and down from the appellate bench. The flavor of reform I find the most intriguing that was proposed, I think in the Yale Law Journal, would put forward a plan where you have 15 justices, 5 appointed by Democratic presidents, 5 by Republican, and then the other 5 can only be seated and they would have to come from the appellate bench. They can only be seated by unanimous consent of the other 10. So it just takes the politics out of it a little bit. Because we can't go on like this, where every time there's a vacancy, there's these games being played, and then an apocalyptic ideological battle over who the appointee is going to be. And if we want to save that institution, I think we have to be ready to tune it up as well.
We have a question from AARP. Doug? You want to wait for the mic?
Nothing is done to update Social Security benefits. Social Security benefits will be cut across the board by 25% in the year 2034. What plans do you have to update this program to prevent such cuts?
Thank you. And again, the condition of Social Security in those years is something that I'm literally have a vested interest in. So we need to make adjustments. But I don't think those adjustments entail cutting the program. I think they entail fortifying the program. You know, Social Security is something that really transformed what it meant to be in this country. By the way, something else that was derided as a slippery slope to communism by some when it was introduced. But really what it meant was that age did not become a sentence of poverty for millions and millions of Americans. I'm also a little puzzled by the vocabulary that refers to it as an entitlement, because it's something we pay for. So to me, it's a promise, and it's a mutual promise. And we should have an honest debate about the different means to get there, many of which will have to include contemplating how revenue works. But I don't believe that there is anything wrong in principle with Social Security, and therefore, I don't believe this needs to be a discussion about cutting benefits for anybody.
Would you wait for the mic? Raise your hand again.
I'm interested, as a former First Lady from Salem, Mass., you haven't talked about education, and that was my husband's foundation, so I'd just like to hear your comments on that.
Yes, thank you. And I married an educator too, and so it's something we think about and talk about a lot. Obviously, there's a lot there, and I'll try in the interest of brevity to just touch a few things. One is that we've got to have more robust pre-kindergarten education. It's just the jury is in, the return on investment is huge, and we've got to find ways to do that, especially in areas where kids are at a structural disadvantage. Then the K through 12 system that needs a number of different kinds of support, but the biggest, in my view, has to do with the regard and the compensation of the teaching profession. We can talk about the conditions, rules, and flexibility and rigor, but at the end of the day, we need to, let me tell you a story that I think about a lot from South Bend. We have a friend who likes to host exchange students, and they had an exchange student from Japan, a country with fantastic educational outcomes. And she wanted to be a teacher. She's this bright high school student. She wanted to qualify for the university program to become a teacher. And they kept in touch with her after she left South Bend and went back to Japan. Very bright student, but very competitive exams. And so when the exam came around, she came up just a little short. She didn't quite make the cut to get into the program for becoming a teacher. So she did what so many people in that situation in Japan do when you're academically very good but not quite good enough to be a teacher. She became a doctor. If you actually evaluate, and actually the head of my policy team did this with a landmark study out of Berkeley, if you actually evaluate the economic impact of teaching, it should be on par with a lot of other professions that are much better compensated, including things like law and medicine. My husband got a master's degree and went into teaching, and with a master's degree, earned less than he did as a bartender when he was a student. So at the end of the day, and the flavor of it I would prefer would begin by offering federal grants to Title I schools where we think teaching makes the biggest difference. But I believe that we need to invest heavily in teacher compensation and then couple that with increased professional development, more opportunities to really increase the benefit, but also the rigor that is expected of teachers. And I believe we can get that done. Let me end, and this is, I could write volumes about this, but I'll give you the kind of nutshell thing. I'm very concerned about the impact of automation and artificial intelligence on our society. I'm chairing a task force of mayors looking at this. You can't have a conversation about automation for long without it becoming really a conversation about the future of work. And you can't talk about the future of work for long without it becoming a conversation about the future of education. And we need to adjust our system into a 21st century system of lifelong learning with a lot more to it than what goes on in technical training or college or the K through 12 system in order to prepare people not so much for the individual technical skills that you need to get, but for the resiliency that will be required for a generation like anybody younger than me who is likely to wind up changing professions more frequently than my parents changed job titles. And there's a lot more to that than our current educational setup can accommodate.
Can you just wait for the mic to come over here? You want to stand so you get the mic?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about drone.
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry, Paul Burkett. I'm with Rathing and Pincatelli up in Concord. I want to ask about drone warfare and what your views are on the strategic and tactical and, in fact, moral and values and imperatives about drone warfare.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously something that impacted my career as a counterterrorism officer. And I think so often we develop a technology first, and then we start thinking about its implications. That being said, I think as we need to create a framework, not only in U.S. Regulation and protocol and standard operating procedure, but also in international law for drone warfare, we also have to recognize that ultimately what's important is not the instrument of a military action, but the policy. So is it or is it not acceptable to target an area where there could be collateral damage, including civilian casualties? In many ways, morally, I think that question is the same, whether there is a pilot seated in an aircraft conducting an airstrike, or whether there is a pilot seated in Nebraska conducting a drone airstrike. The real things we need to talk about are what is and is not acceptable in a framework, by the way, that America helped to design, but is now retreating from, which is the international security and legal framework. And the next president is going to have a lot of work to do. First of all, to establish some of these guardrails, not just around something like drones, but just more broadly, what are the levels at which we would commit U.S. troops? And when I see the National Security Advisor carrying around a notepad designed to kind of telegraph an intention to maybe commit troops to deal with the situation in Venezuela, it makes me think that there is not a very well thought through doctrine in our White House right now about when we would even make noises about military intervention. But then more broadly, the next president is going to have a lot of work to do establishing U.S. credibility in the international space. Because if we want to have any kind of international norms or agreements, the same as we do around other kinds of destructive weaponry or around conflict in general, I would prefer for America to be in a leading position. And it is no longer something you can take for granted that in any international process that is being negotiated, with the Chinese model in the ascendant and the Russian model not going away, and the Saudi model getting apparently less constrained by the day, it is not obvious that without some heavy lifting morally, that the U.S. can even continue to expect that we'll have the leadership position in those debates.
Young lady here, just wait for the mic. The mic is, okay, the microphone is right here.
Microphone is here. Hi, Marilyn Hoffman. As I said, I've been doing some work in South Bend, and it's a great city. Thank you for coming here, even though it's 6 degrees or something this morning.
Makes me feel right at home.
You mentioned you're going to try to do something with your roundabouts with some public sculpture. Could you talk a little bit, if you were president, how you would set a national arts policy? Because I think, particularly in cities, the arts have a great capacity in bringing people together, and education and community building and so many areas. And what you would do about supporting the National Endowment for the Arts.
Yes, thank you for that. It's so important, and I think sometimes we think of art as a kind of luxury, when actually art and culture is so core to our national identity. I think of that quote. I think it was John Adams. I must study politics and war so that, I don't have the whole quote memorized, but essentially so that the next generation could do technical work, so the generation after that could live in the highest sense as human beings, spending all their time contemplating art. Obviously, it didn't work out quite that way, but I would like to believe that human progress has to do with achievements in the arts and culture. Also, at a more functional basis, a city and I think a country does better when everybody has access to a rich cultural life. Certainly in South Bend, for example, maybe you've had a chance to see our river lights. It's this amazing light sculpture. It's difficult to describe, but you got to see it. So y'all just have to come South Bend and check it out. But we did it as part of a major anniversary event for the city, and it just bathes these cascades in our river with light. It's dynamic, and like all good charismatic public art, it draws people to it. And it draws different people to it. And then it creates these chance encounters and collisions where the different people encounter each other. And at a moment when common experiences, shared touchstones, outside of a Twitter bubble or a Fox News echo chamber, they're so precious, these things that we have in common, that you could be from any number of different backgrounds and appreciate something beautiful. I would argue there's almost a national security implication to having those kinds of shared touchstones. So what do we do as a practical matter? Certainly, I think the National Endowment for the Arts is a very important part of that and needs to be funded. We should also think about things that some forward-leaning cities and states have done where you do, for example, a % for art requirement. So if you're building a bridge, 1% of the funds that goes to that goes into a fund on the side, and that is committed for purposes of supporting public art. Something like that, I think, makes sure that we don't view it as a luxury good, but we view it as something no less important than the things that get more attention in those legislative processes. And I think when we do, in ways that are intangible and hard to explain, but also impossible to miss, that we become a better country in all the ways that we can count to.
One of the gentlemen all the way in the back, just wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Ryan Sempf. Thank you, Mayor, for being here today. I'm here to ask about Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States and costs our country about $290 billion this year alone, and is projected by 2050 to cost $1.1 trillion a year. And so I'm wondering, as president, what would you do to fight Alzheimer's?
Thank you. And it's something that's a question that's close to me because someone I care about is going through that right now. And it's such a cruel disease. And there are so many families that have been affected by it. The good news is we have a better understanding of it than we did in the past, but the crushing thing is that we're not that much closer to a cure. So one thing is it's a reminder of why basic research is important and why federal support for basic research is needed, and why the National Institutes of Health, for example, and the CDC need to be lifted up and given the regard that they are due. It's also an indication that we need to do more within our health system to make sure people are taken care of, because I witnessed firsthand, no matter where you are in life, it is a cruel and crushing disease. If you happen to be low income, it is frightening how you get kicked from one place to another that may or may not have a good memory unit. And because memory care overlaps with what we think of as nursing care, right, which is one of the most expensive parts of the long tail of medical costs. We need to have a system that can take care of everybody. And if you're on Medicaid and you have dementia, it is an even darker place to be than it is for anybody with a family member dealing with this. So it's one reason why I think we need a more equitable healthcare system overall. I don't think it falls to a president to think up the cure, but you shouldn't have to be that in order to create the environment where we make more of those kinds of advancements. And everything from basic research to support for a healthcare system that can accommodate those who are suffering from it. And if you think about it, I mean, the numbers you just cited dwarf the number of billions of dollars going into R&D on this issue, suggesting that there may be a market failure. That's exactly where the right kind of targeted basic research support from federal sources can perhaps help to close the gap.
The student in the back.
Hi, my name is David. I'm a student here at St. Anselm College and a resident of New Hampshire. New Hampshire has been greatly affected by the opioid crisis. The City of Manchester, its fire department responds to more overdoses than it does fires. If elected president, what would your administration do to combat this epidemic?
Thank you. That's a big issue where I come from, too. And had great conversations with Mayor Craig about the steps that they've taken, among other things, the Safe Station program, which helps get some of these pills off the streets and into a safe place, which is a very wise policy. Needs to be backed up by federal help, too. And there are several pieces to this. From a South Bend perspective that I think maps to a national perspective, there are a couple things we think would make the biggest difference. One, frankly, is to hold accountable any bad actors. So we are part of a lawsuit holding accountable, we believe, pharmaceutical companies that engaged in dishonest practices related to the threats of opioids. That being said, I want to make sure we don't slide into talking about opioids as though they are universally bad. We're on the just coming off a very difficult experience in my own family, where my father, during the end of his life, benefited greatly from good medical care, which included the use of fentanyl. So it's not about should these exist or should they not, it's how do we keep them from destroying lives outside of a clinical context? How do we keep hospitalizations from turning into addictions? And how do we stop addictions on the street from developing from prescription drug abuse to heroin abuse? The biggest thing I think would make a difference is more medically assisted therapy. We know medically that this can be treated, that there are ways for treating addiction that unfortunately not enough people are qualified to do. There are licensing hangups with how many people are able to prescribe and also how much any one doc is able to prescribe with things like methadone. And we need to create, by whatever, either disentangling of regulatory hurdles or outright funding of training and certification, whatever it takes in order to have an adequate number of people certified for medication-assisted therapy. Last, but certainly not least, right now you can recover from an overdose in a hospital, and our South Bend paramedics or Manchester paramedics bring you back to life. We put you in a hospital, and then you're on your own. And then we expect you during the 3 or 6 weeks that you're waiting to get seen by some kind of professional help. We're expecting you to just kind of hold on for that amount of time. It's not realistic. So we're working in South Bend to get people, interveners, many of whom are people who've recovered themselves from addiction, to the bedsides of people in that situation to try to fill in that gap. And again, I think that's something that good federal support would make a lot easier for the mayors and county officials who are on the front lines of this problem to tackle and be a wind at their backs.
Thank you. Eric Schlepphorst from Granite State Independent Living. 2020 is marked not only by a presidential election, but it's also the 30th anniversary of the American with Disabilities Act that protects the civil rights of those living with disabilities. Mm-hmm. As president, what would you do to ensure that those civil rights continue to be protected as they feel like they're being somewhat threatened in the current environment?
Yeah. Thank you for that, and it's so important. The good news is, I think as a country, we're evolving toward a better understanding of disability. The visibility of people with disabilities has grown, and we need to continue on that path. The Americans with Disabilities Act didn't just benefit people with disabilities. You think about the curb cut effect, right? So there was a lot of anxiety and grumbling about, and frankly, mayors like me that got to change the way that our sidewalks work, and it's expensive. But it's not just for those who are, for example, in a wheelchair. Anybody who's ever pushed a stroller or pulled a rollerboard bag is better off that we now live in a country where those curb cuts are expected. So it's just one example of how we all do better when we all do better. And I think that needs to be the underlying philosophy as we begin to, first of all, acknowledge more forms of disability and recognize their right to be protected, but also just make sure we're holding the line on the protections that do exist and take the ADA seriously. So thanks for raising the visibility of that issue.
Two more. I'm going to take the young lady here and then Michael Harrington.
All right. Thank you.
They're really excited about voting because it's a lot of their first time voting in the election. How do I help them decipher the candidates that are out there and like lead them to getting to you.
All right. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for supporting me. Keep flying the flag. It sounds like I've got a great ally in Boston, so thank you for that. Look, I think it's safe to say I'm not extremely famous. So a big part of the challenge for us is just getting known. Now, I think that our party, especially in moments like this when there's a widespread field, I'd like to think that our party is favorable turf for newcomers and underdogs, and has a general knack for giving a young person with a funny name coming out of nowhere a shot. But the truth is, we just need to make sure people hear the message. We need to make sure that it resonates. And the benefit of some of the tools that weren't available, even 5 years ago, let alone 20, right? Some of these digital organizing tools is part of it. But a lot of it's just old-fashioned human, those dorm room conversations, right, where you're kicking around what our country ought to look like. And I think the biggest thing to say to a young person looking at their choices is, isn't it time that we had somebody who regards these issues not as somebody else's problem, but as our own? Shouldn't we at least have that voice on the stage? And by the way, if you can't quite get them there to supporting me today, just ask them to help me get on the debate stage. So the DNC, which is bending over backwards to not be accused of unfairness this time, has created as level a playing field as I've seen, including the fact that if they have to do more than one debate just to fit everybody in, there won't be a so-called kiddie table or undercard debate. They'll just randomize it. They've also set a high threshold, though, for what it takes to get invited, including having to have 65,000 individual contributors. Now, the good news is this is not you can do it at any level. It could be $2. So for on the off chance that you haven't convinced the whole campus that they're all for me on just yet, just ask them to help me get on that stage, and then it'll be up to me to close the deal. You could also encourage people to tune in on Sunday night. We got the CNN town hall, so we'll ask folks to organize watch parties, and I'm seeing the thumbs up, so hopefully we're on your roster there. And thanks so much for the support. Thank you.
We have time for Michael Harrington wanted to make a quick question so we could get, not just, I have a luncheon, I just got The Honorable Michael Harrington.
Thank you. Mayor, your opening in terms of recognition that the structures of governance are simply proving more ineffectual with a greater degree of rapidity, fancy word, an inflection point is being reached for years, and this is mostly conversation into my bathroom mirror. I have been an advocate of an American approach to the use of a parliamentary system. Question is, now that we've been disabused incrementally, but I think with some degree of defined growth in the curve, that this society is the product of some sort of immutable, immaculate conception, and it isn't, you prepared to basically suggest that we call for a constitutional convention, if for no other reason, an overdue civics lesson for a country that is nearly devoid of any particular history or appreciation for the need for it?
Thank you for putting that in context. I do think we need to entertain constitutional remedies to some of our problems. And by the way, this should not be regarded as a fanatical or overly bold thought, because it's woven into the fabric of the Constitution itself. 40 years ago, Birch Bayh, senator of Indiana, not exactly a crazy out of left field figure, was helping to author countless constitutional amendments, an attempt at the Electoral College, lowering the voting age to 18, which I think we can be glad of. The 25th Amendment, which may be needed one day. I didn't say which day. The ERA, which sadly didn't make it, and again on this International Women's Day, I think we should ask whether there's unfinished business there. So if the system isn't working, its most elegant feature is its capacity to be tuned up. And as you said, it's not an immaculate conception. Things are the way they are for a certain set of reasons, many of which are very quirky, or some of which are quite dark. They have to do with negotiating the interests of slave states. So why not, if we know that there could be a better way, not casually, not lightly, not without regard to the profound ripple effects of any structural change, but given that the structure has let us down, See, to me, a presidency like the one we're living in is a symptom, not a cause. It doesn't even get, someone like this doesn't even get to within cheating distance unless countless people feel that the system has let them down. People where I come from, under no illusions about the current character of the current president, who went in with eyes wide open and voted to burn the house down because of how they felt the system was working for them. So why not shore it up? And in a country that changed its constitution so that you couldn't drink, and then realized that was a bad idea and changed it back. We have the mechanisms to do this responsibly, but boldly. And bold structural thinking is literally the character of the American project. Why at this vulnerable and critically important moment, this inflection point, as you said, in the life of our democracy, why would we not tend to our democracy with bold thinking once again? Thank you.
We want to thank Mayor Pete for stopping by the Politics and Eggs, and he's going to stay here. For anyone that wanted to ask us questions, we'll be more than happy to answer them for you, but we want to thank him for being here. Look forward to seeing him on the campaign trail here in New Hampshire. Thank you.